Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies at Charles Darwin University, and welcome to Outrider 23, Backward Mapping. This concept will change your life, and it will certainly transform your PhD. It will transform your research planning, because it renders your PhD predictable, rational, and understandable. What we're going to do today is we're going to transform the relationship between you, your research, and time management. And the session today is the first of 4. We're going to have a series of 4 where we're going to introduce milestones to you. And let me explain why. What happens so often in higher degree programs is students are over time. And there are all sorts of consequences when a student is over time, to mental health, to finances, to personal and professional relationships. So we need to do everything that we can to ensure a student finishes in the minimum time. And in the United Kingdom, in Australia, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, that minimum time is 3 years. We need to get you finished in 3 years. For our colleagues around the world in different systems, after you've finished your mandatory or comprehensive examinations and you're working completely on your thesis, it's about finishing that thesis component as quickly as possible. So today we are going to offer a theory, a trope, and a strategy for planning. And of course, this trope can be applied far beyond your PhD. I use it on a daily basis whenever one has a large research project. And remember, I'm working on my 21st book at this point. Whenever we have a large project, I use backward mapping to ensure I deliver that research project in a timely fashion within deadlines. And backward mapping is also referred to as backward design. You may have heard about it, but today we're going to drill deeply and explain why it's going to change your life. What's happening is we're going to introduce backward mapping this week, and then we're going to take it for a walk through milestones. And the reason why we're sharing this moment with you is this is an historic time in the higher degree program at Charles Darwin University. It's important for our students, but it's also great to share this with our friends and our colleagues around the world. We are about to introduce milestones into Charles Darwin University. Now, CDU, like many universities around the world, for about the last 30 years, has used the annual review of progress. So a student and a supervisor fill in a form, often a paper form, and explain what they've done in the last year. You know, it's like when you're in primary school. What did I do on my holidays? And so you explain in this annual review of progress what you did in the last year. And that's fine. You've stated what you've done in the last year. Backward mapping is different, and it's configured within a milestone system. What milestones do is say, here is your completed thesis. Yes, what have you done this year? But what you've done this year, how is that leading to a completed thesis? So everything is about the completion. And the milestones are the punctuation points, to get you to completion. And the reason why we're introducing milestones now, and there are many reasons why milestones are the gold standard in thinking about how we organise a candidature, but there are lots of reasons why we need to do it now. Students around the world are now confronting a series of profound mental health concerns, financial instability, but also profound competitiveness for jobs. And if you've got a choice between somebody who's completed a PhD in 3 years and somebody who's completed a PhD in 5.5 years, who do you think you're going to hire? So therefore, with these macro concerns in place, the time has come to introduce milestones, to render what often seems to be a chaotic PhD system, to render that system ordered and rational and predictable. So we have to make sure, we have a responsibility to make sure that our students finish quickly and they finish with high quality research. So we also, the other challenge is right now, our higher degree programs have never been more diverse in terms of the sociology of the students enrolled. So we also need a strategy to acknowledge and welcome that diversity, to ensure that these diverse doctoral students reach the standard of a PhD without standardisation. Now, Candido and Kinchin demonstrated profoundly how backward mapping enables cross cultural supervision in particular. Now, remember last week we talked about the Uberification of the PhD and the consequences of homology, just endlessly repeating the same way of doing a PhD. Well, what the research is now demonstrating is backward mapping and milestones together enable supervisors and students from diverse backgrounds to agree on particular processes and be very clear in terms of the tracking to the completion of that thesis. And can I say, backward mapping and milestones also work unbelievably well for one of the more diverse modes of doctorate, that is the artifact exegesis thesis. Those modes of theses very complicated and a lot can go wrong, and milestones and backward mapping really get that mode of doctorate organised. So what we're learning so far is that backward mapping really respects your diversity, and it enables that diversity of students to step and walk gently and predictably in a mappable, trackable fashion to your completion. How good is this? So we're going to move through the 3 milestones of your PhD in the next 3 Outriders. So we are going to talk about the confirmation of candidature, the mid-thesis review, and the final thesis review, 1, 2, 3. But for all our friends around the world and our friends at CDU, if you're in a difficult place right now, if you're in your candidature and say you are over time today, you're over 3 years today, then what we're going to talk about with backward mapping, wherever you are, will get you home, okay? This will enable you to complete. And of course, I have a friend that's joining me for the month. His name is Hector. Hector follows me around the world. And I always use Hector as a reminder, and of course I have a lot of skulls in my office. Those of you that know my office and have joined us for Digital Office Hours, I have a lot of skulls in my life. And there's a reason for that. Yes, I'm an old goth, but the skulls provide me with a daily reminder that time matters, and none of us must waste time. When we waste time, we waste our life, because we all end up like Hector. Time is so incredibly precious because it is finite. And the reason Hector is accompanying us through this journey through backward mapping and milestones is he's a reminder of a great truth that has a really deep resonance in my life. And actually, to be frank, it's the guiding question in my life that I ask myself every morning. And my key question is, how would you live your life differently if you knew the date and the time of your death? How would you live your life differently if you knew the date and the time of your death? Now, that question encourages backward mapping, because here's the point of my death. Now, what am I going to do with this life to reach that end point? What's going to happen here before that death? Now, that's backward mapping. So while we're thinking about Hector and death, really what we're doing today is thinking about life and your thesis. Backward mapping is termed backward planning or backward design. It is a theory and a strategy that was first used by teachers in the school system to create learning experiences that would enable the completion of learning goals. So Williams, Bethel, and Lawson demonstrated how backward mapping in particular enables iterative leaps in research. So it's been applied very strongly in research portfolios. And what backward mapping does is it allows us to really say, right, well, these are the outcomes of research, and it allows us to predictively enable those iterative transformations. Very useful for research. So to commence backward mapping, what do? The first thing we do is we configure learning objectives. What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to learn? What skills do we want to gain? Now, we are really overt with those learning objectives. So be clear. It's not like, oh, I'd like world peace. Yeah, nah. Yeah, nah. So what are the learning objectives? And render them as granular as you can. And then we backwardly map from those learning objectives. And then from that point, we work out, okay, that's where I'm going. This is what I have to do. What skills do I need to get myself there? Now, in primary and secondary education, these learning objectives are often linked with national curricula. So in most nations around the world, there are standards. This is what a national curriculum is. And so backward mapping allows individual teachers and individual schools to ensure that they reach those national standards in the national curricula. And can I say, this was quite a radical change in teacher education. So much of teacher education, when I started my education degrees, and can I say one of my education degrees, I started in 1992. That's before many of you were born, young Skywalker. But can I say, it was a bit of a bonkers time. It wasn't a very enjoyable degree, can I say. So I was in this teacher education degree, and day after day after day, they'd be teaching lesson plans, right? This is how you do a lesson plan, day after day after day. But the problem was that the teachers that were being trained at that time were certainly trained to do individual lesson plans, but there was no real sense of the bigger picture of what the student was actually trying to learn overall. And that might be through the semester or through the term or through the calendar year. So backward mapping then emerged in teacher training to ensure that, okay, those lesson plans are actually linked to wider issues in the national curriculum, the learning goals that need to be achieved in a term or a semester or a year. So that means that students are doing assessment, they're doing assignments for a reason. And that reason is they're linked with much bigger goals about learning. And that requires backward mapping so that we focus on goals and not process. Now, as you've worked out, so that's one of the heritages of backward mapping. But as you might have worked out, this is an ideal theory for a PhD. This is an ideal way to get you to that completion quickly. And indeed, basically any research project, and as I said, I use it for every book I write. Every research project, backward mapping is useful because it actually reminds us, oh, look, the process, that's great, but the process doesn't matter too much because everything is about achieving the goal. So you have one job. You have one job. You have one job. You have one accessible object, and that is your PhD. And in most Australian universities, you don't even have an oral exam with that PhD. So you've got one accessible object, the PhD. So that means all of the learning outcomes, all of the goals are on that one accessible object. So that means, therefore, that your backward mapping starts there. We have a time limit. 3 years. We have a time limit, 3 years. We have an outcome. We have a learning object. That is your thesis. Okay, great. We're ready. So now we have to backward map. What do you need to know? What do you need to do to deliver a 70,000 to 100,000 words to an international examiner in 3 years? There it is. That's what a PhD is. And that's why we use milestones, 3 of them. We have the confirmation of candidature, mid-thesis review, final thesis review. And the reason we have those milestones is we are backward mapping your candidature to examination. When backward mapping happens in school-based education, it's driven by teachers. So teachers look at a curriculum and they break down the learning outcomes into accessible and into teachable objects. For a PhD, this backward mapping is much more of a partnership between the supervisor and the student. Together, you create that backward mapping protocol. Now, most of you know I plan the entire thesis with my students in their first meeting. In their first meeting, I do a diagnostic and break the thesis down so that they finish in 3 years. And I've always said, sorry to be real on this, but I've always said this, that the only way to finish a PhD in 3 years is to have a really, really good first year. You've got to work hard in the first year. I give my students the target of you have to finish 3 chapters to pretty good standard in the first year. Then they're almost definitely going to complete in 3 years, by the way. So I make them work hard in the first year. Now, if you decide to be slack in the first year, and only you can make that determination about yourself and your life, but if you decide to be slack in the first year, then you're pretty well stuffed. And that's a technical phrase. You're pretty well stuffed, and you're going to be spending the rest of your enrolment catching up for the stuff that you should have done in first year. For our dear friends out there who are about to start, please remember the old dean, okay? Make the first year count. You'll get that thesis home if you work hard in the first year. So in that first meeting of your PhD, you must backward map. Start with the completion in 3 years. Break down the chapters to a granular level if you can. Then break down the work that's required in each individual chapter. And then once you've got the task orientation in place, you then configure time orientation. So you place a particular timeline around those tasks. And then, okay, you've done that. Start, girlfriend, start. That's backward mapping. So whether we're talking about primary school, whether we're talking about a PhD, backward mapping has particular characteristics. What happens is you spend a lot of time, what I call front loading. So you spend a lot of planning time, and this planning time is filled with learning objectives, demonstration of learning, formative assessment, summative assessment, and review of learning. 5 stages. Don't be frightened of those phrases. And once that cycle of 5 is completed, then you go through the next cycle of 5 and you plan. So as you can see, milestones allow you to simplify this backward mapping. You're not on your own. You've got these touch points where you can actually check in and be assessed. So even if you don't know what formative or summative assessment is, this will get you home. Now, in your milestones, you're asked for your professional development. Have you ever wondered why you're asked, what professional development have you done this year? That is formative assessment. And then you're asked, what publications, what seminars have you delivered? That is summative assessment. And of course, your chapters that you have completed are a demonstration of your learning. See what's happening? So backward mapping is incredibly important because it ensures that students are successful and that students reach their goals. So for supervisors and teachers, it renders a candidature predictable, rational, and logical. And trust me, the one thing you need in a PhD is predictability and rationality. Now, none of this is reliant on inspiration or accidents or surprises. Backward mapping is about coherence. It's about predictability. It's adding predictability to learning and predictability to research. The challenge, I think, with backward mapping in the doctoral space is that it is a teacher-led theory in school-based education, and it's much more of a partnership between a student and a supervisor. But it's a complicated partnership, isn't it? Because the point is, almost all PhD students have not done a PhD before. So you're making statements about what's required to do a PhD and you've never done one before. But most supervisors have completed 10, 20, 50, 100, 200 PhD students, right? So we actually know what's going on. We know the shape of success. We've read the research, so we know when you do something, so you go on a leave of absence, say for example, when you do something, we know via the longitudinal research what could be the consequences of that decision, right? That's why we're so careful with you. But we know what works and what doesn't. So that's why it's a bit of an unequal relationship, because we're offering you advice because we know what happens when you make particular decisions, yeah? But students in the doctoral program, you are setting up your own individual experience of a PhD. So every PhD experience really is singular. Your backward mapping will be very different from your friend's backward mapping. And while in, say, a year 4 classroom, all the students in grade 4, year 4, have to reach that same sort of level and they're tested at that level, and the classroom activities are pretty well the same for all students, every single PhD is different. The way in which it is assessed is the same, but every PhD is different because it must be an original contribution to knowledge. So, the doctoral space is bespoke and it is customised. Therefore, your backward mapping is all about you. It has to fit your project, your progress, and who you are. Backward mapping can really, really help you. And the reason why it's so successful, team, in the doctoral space is because a PhD is simply too big. It's too big to hold in your mind, right? And 3 years of a candidature, it's too big to hold in your mind. So how do some students respond to that bigness? Well, some just sort of make a cup of coffee and start scrolling through Instagram, right? Oh, all right, well, that's all a bit big. Let me just go through Insta, right? I understand that because the scale of the PhD creates fear. It creates paralysis. So backward mapping and milestones stop the fear and stop the paralysis because it says backward mapping, what are you doing today? What task are you inserting in this particular time? So you're breaking down your thesis into your reading, your experiments, your field work, your archival work into bite-sized chunks. So what you need to do, at its most basic, it's called chunking, is write down these chunks of tasks and then put a length of time attached to their completion, and then just get on with it, girlfriend, then just do it. The final great strength of backward mapping is that it makes you and your supervisor focus on assessment. How are you, during the thesis, demonstrating how you're completing this work? So it's not about this, oh, I'm doing it, I'm doing a PhD. Are you? I'm doing a PhD, yeah, nah. So the goal is to reach an accessible standard for your PhD. But you need to, through milestones, demonstrate how you are completing it. So it's not this, you have to provide evidence, formative and summative assessment at the milestones to show that this is backwardly mapped correctly. So the meta point about backward mapping is it is a strategy of learning that teaches you about a PhD. So this is a mode of supervision that teaches students how to supervise through the continual iterative review of progress. So the key change in backward mapping, the intervention it makes in business as usual in doctoral education, is that you have to think about the final thesis at the start. You have to think at the start about the teaching and the learning activities that you will do to create the evidence to prove that you are on track for a 3-year completion. Backward mapping therefore solves the 2 great errors or flaws that emerge in a candidature. Firstly, the purposelessness of so many candidatures. Students just sort of drift along without any real sense of what the project is or what they're doing. That's a pretty big group. Backward mapping stops that. And also it stops the other great huge group in doctoral education, which are people where the thesis is just too generalised. The thesis is just too big. And so backward mapping and milestones cuts the legs off a series of projects really early, so it's not sort of a generalizable project. You know exactly what you're doing. So backward mapping gives you a purpose. It gives you a focus. It cuts away the extraneous bits of a project early and quickly. Backward mapping reminds all of us, colleagues, you only have one output. You have one job: produce a thesis. And this output has a singular audience, your examiners. So anything that you're doing that's not involving the thesis and examiners, ask yourself why you're doing it. Why you're doing it. Each day, focus on the examiners and the examination. So as we move into these milestones in the next 3 weeks, please remember the stages of backward mapping. What is the result that you want? That's a thesis. What evidence will you require to demonstrate progress to that output? And 3, what activities and actions will enable the production of that evidence? And that's it. The take-home message of backward mapping is begin with the end in mind. Commence your thesis thinking about the ending. Backward mapping is purposeful. It means you don't drift. It means you remember the ending and you remember how incredibly precious time is. We wish you love, light, and peace. Tea out.